Hey guys, Bugcat7 here. Okay, it is Wednesday, January 29th, 2020, and I want to thank you for visiting the Stonewall Research channel here on YouTube. Thank you very much. I really do appreciate it. Alright, guys, well, I figured while we were going through my series here on the quote unquote giants or large hominids, as I like to call them, state by state, and while we're looking at all these accounts that contain all these artifacts and large skeletal remains with copper armor, copper artifacts of a variety of different kinds of copper artifacts, including celts and arrowheads and spearheads and knives and swords, etc., etc. So we often hear these accounts, these details of the artifacts and the accounts of these large skeletal remains, and that would seem to coincide with the time period in question. So when you hear articles, archaeological articles done about these things, you can automatically assume it takes place during the time period in which these rather large hominids and humanoid type creatures were inhabiting these lands in North America and around the world. So, and you have to remember, and why is this so important? Why is this so relevant? What I'm going to read to you about in this article, pretty serious article from Central States Archaeological Journal, and by the C.J. Nyberger about, whether the Midwest pre-Columbian Indians were casting metal. And it seems, their experiments would confirm that they could even do it with steel. They could reach temperatures with the types of systems that they created to create these furnaces. So in any case, you have to remember why it's so important. And if you've been a subscriber for a while on my channel, you know I produced this video about the Michigan copper and these oxide ingots that were supposedly only found around the Mediterranean and involved with ancient civilizations and had nothing to do with the Americas at all. However, and I went over this when I read the article to you there from this Michigan Copper article that I read. 500 million pounds. So all the tens of thousands of artifacts found in North America all fit in a small, medium-sized boulder. But 500 million pounds, where did it all go? Well, it just happens to be these oxide ingots, and I mentioned that I saw when they were doing the Public Works project during Roosevelt administration there down in the 1930s, the Tennessee Valley Authority, when they were, building the dam down there, they showed these excavations where they had the oxide molds, sand molds, which is often how they do this. So we're going to go over that in the article as well. And mainstream, would lead us to believe that, there was no casting going on. These people had not achieved that level of sophistication with their metallurgy. So we're going to look at some proofs to the contrary of that. Okay. And as I said, a pretty serious article. And you also have to remember, too, that the rancher that went out into Galena Canyon looking for gold, and when he found the Torreones, the 500 Torreones over there, he also found evidence of some sort of, metal processing going on there. He found sites with slag. So what were they melting over there? According to mainstream, again, these people were incapable, even though they created these furnaces and kilns for their pottery, but yet they hadn't done anything with metals, which is, a little hard to believe. So we're going to take a look at that. And don't forget, too, that the bell beaker culture in Europe, if you recall, I went over this before. it's in its early phase. The Velveeta culture is a Western contemporary accordion wear culture. Beaker folk, and they call them the Velveeta place. So listen to this. In its mature phase, the Velveeta culture is understood as not only a collection of characteristic artifact types, but a complex cultural phenomena involving metalwork in copper and gold, archery, specific types of ornamentation, and presumably shared ideological, cultural, and religious ideas. Okay? So, supposedly the Velveeta brought metallurgy to, it just is a coincidence. And the Velveeta people seem to be very similar to the Adena, except they're slightly smaller and their craniums are not quite as vaulted. They have vaulted craniums, vaulted skulls, but not quite as big as the Adena. And the Adena were the biggest as far as how many centimeters, cubic centimeters of brain material, how many cc's of brain material was there. The Adena were the largest. Okay, and I'm always talking about how did this flow? Did it flow from the new world, the old world? We're going to read more about that too. At the end of this week, we're going to start getting into a new book, and it addresses a lot of the things that we've been talking about on my channel and Phil's channel and Andrew's channel about how this worldwide diffusion of construction and engineering knowledge was spread all over the world by probably the same class of peoples. And, this is related to that. So let's get into it because it's kind of lengthy. I'm going to try to get through most of it for you, I hope. But let's look at the abstract. And if you didn't know, there's good evidence that shows that these pre-Columbian, quote-unquote, Indians, these rather large hominid peoples, were casting with, molten metal and copper specifically, but who knows? Abstract. For over a century, there's been a controversy over whether prehistoric Midwest Indians possessed the technology and skills needed to cast copper. The Great Lakes region is rich in native copper metal, and for thousands of years, the supply supported a metalworking industry, the Old Copper Complex, from which over 20,000 copper artifacts have been found. Early archaeologists believed that many of these artifacts were cast. Current thought states that the Indians did not have the technology to melt copper and thus did not cast. Newly discovered sites, artifacts, and experiments show evidence of a high heat technology, most often associated with Hopewell and Mississippian cultures. And don't forget, this is 1987, so not aware of current, the Hopewell, though they may have been contemporaries of the Adena, may have been people of just, average height. Similar to that of the Watusi and the Tutsi people, okay, who live in that sort of two-tiered relationship in their society where these tall people were the royalty or, people of importance in the society. So, newly discovered sites, artifacts, and experiments show evidence of high heat technology, most often associated with Hopewell and Mississippian cultures. This includes furnaces, 2 years, crucibles, mold materials, slag, and castings, indicating the existence of, I think it's occasionally used metal casting technology in prehistoric times. A new look. A Midwest American Indian used copper for many thousands of years. Over 20,000 copper artifacts have been found as surface finds or removed from shallow excavations. Most of these quote-unquote old coppers appear to be hammered from float copper. Some samples show signs of being cast, and whether they were or not has been vigorously debated for over a century. In the ancient Middle East, Asia, and Europe, there was a natural progression over the last 7,000 years where metal, copper, gold, iron technology passed through stages employing hammering, annealing, melting, casting, and alloying techniques wartime. I guess, is the author associated with it. This also occurred in pre-Columbian America, especially in South and Central America, and to a lesser extent in the Southwest United States, Hohokam bells. So back to the Hohokam, which I did a video about too, of them having some very advanced techniques, including metallurgy, where copper was cast and then wrought. Conclusive evidence from prehistoric castings in the Midwest is lacking at the present time. This paper will explore new developments in this controversy. In a culture capable of casting copper, one should see evidence that 1. There was copper metal available. 2. It was collected. 3. High heat in excess of 1083 degrees centigrade melting point of copper was controlled and used with the metal. Tools were involved in the casting process: furnaces, crucibles, tongs, molds, slag, and these can be linked to known dated sites. Authentic castings exist, and they are associated with the documented sites. History of a controversy. Many early archaeologists believed that some quote-unquote old copper was manufactured by casting. This concept was based on numerous artifacts which exhibited right-angle bends, joints without folds, laps, and other structural characteristics which could not be produced by any other mode of manufacture, hammering or welding. Unfortunately, many of these artifacts are surface finds and are poorly documented as to culture, site, and date. Though possessing a deep patina and unique corrosion patterns, worm tracks, quote unquote, similar to artifacts found at documented sites, most specimens are cultural orphans. Many archaeologists disagree, stating that Midwest natives did not cast metal. Some claim that copper artifacts, we've got to go to the next page. Yeah. And they're showing a celt here, an old copper, quote unquote, celt from Wisconsin Milwaukee Public Museum, featuring a large hollow casting bubble. 2 test castings above demonstrate a similar bubble caused by pouring metal into a wet sand mold, the same type of sand mold I saw there in the Tennessee Valley for the ox hides. And here's an old copper knife from Wisconsin showing corrosion elevation worm tracks. Note the standard X-ray image above showing faint irregular radiolucencies, typical of wrought work manufacture. So this one was a hammered piece, and it shows it in the X-rays, evidences of this. The artifacts were not even annealed, though there is ample evidence of this type of heat treatment. Those artifacts showing signs of casting are often excused from consideration by being assumed as quote-unquote historic or quote-unquote fake. The non-cast theory has been repeated so often that some authors consider it an incontestable truth and discount or downplay evidence of melting, even though their own research indicates casting. Identification of casting. There are numerous artifacts which show signs of melting casting. This is determined by changes in the surface configuration, flow lines, suck back or blowholes, bubbles, fused right angle bends, and internal identification of the metal in the form of large grain size. And it's giving this micro gas bubbles between the grains that appear at a microscopic level. These diagnostic criteria are not always apparent because of poor artifact preservation. Recovery, damage, corrosion, metallographic changes due to aging, cremation, and wrought working after supposed casting can disguise many signs of melting. Okay, so it's wrought. When they say wrought working, is that these things were cast maybe, and then they were wrought with hammers, let's say, to get the air bubbles out of them. And that's how you would do it if you had casts, to make them, harder and more stable. When compared to the numbers of cast metal artifacts from ancient Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, there are relatively few castings in the Midwest. There is little evidence of molds, crucible, furnaces, or tools needed to produce castings. This supports the continued skepticism concerning a Midwest prehistoric casting technology. If ancient Indians did cast, why is there so little evidence of such important and useful technology? I believe that in select situations, Midwest Indians did melt and cast copper objects, reaching the open mold casting stage of development. Most castings appear to have been poured as blanks and wrought work into final form. This wrought working disguises or obliterates many diagnostic signs of casting, including these gas bubbles, evident in it from the water. Hydrogen gas gets it, hydrogen gas bubbles get into it. And figure 3, an old copper banner crescent from Manitoba County, Wisconsin. Note the suck back voids caused by turbulence and contraction of the molten copper when poured. The position, depth, and circular shape of the voids cannot be created by wrought working. And only when you have these sand molds used. A large copper spud from Wisconsin, and it says a large copper spud. I wonder how large we're talking about. It looks pretty big. Showing right angle bends with no laps or folds. Morphology possible only by casting. So the form and shape is only possible by casting. It's not possible to do that by hammering. Zero radiographs of 3 copper spear points from Wisconsin. Point A has irregular and elongated voids, which are diagnostic for wrought work only manufacture. Points B and C have many small round gas bubbles, typical of cast manufacture. Point C displays casting bubbles along with a fold, large on the bottom, indicating both casting and wrought work. Okay, so both casting and wrought work after the casting. Bowls in thin castings can be compressed by hammering so as to be difficult to detect when radiographed. Surface voids, bubbles, flow lines, and internal grain structure can be altered by repeated hammering and annealing, heating, polishing, and corrosion. Copper is found in abundance in the Great Lakes area in the form of float copper. It is 99.6% pure, originally be formed by crystallization 1 billion years ago. Copper can be collected from the surface or mined just below ground surface. There are many prehistoric mining sites on float copper, natural or hammered, assemblages in the Midwest dating around 5,000 BC or earlier. This is way before Native American Indians and during the time of these rather large hominids or humanoids. Though other metals exist in a natural state, copper is most plentiful and is used by the inhabitants of the Midwest up to present times. Okay, so I'm getting short on time. I'm going to skip to the more or less the conclusion of this thing here, and we'll just read through the most, big points of what they're trying to say by this article. It's too long. Is a crack appearing in overworked copper lump from Island Royal. This problem can be avoided by frequent annealing and so folding the metal back into itself, heating and folding. Here's some of the furnaces that they found at the Turner Mounds in Ohio, which they say are Hopewell, but we know the Hopewell are contemporaries with the Adena. Here's this zero radiograph old copper knife with a large number of small round casting bubbles in it. And that's, from museums, not just anywhere. Oh, okay. Let me get to this, folks. All right. Discussion. There are a few documented cases of prehistoric casting. What castings have been found are often ignored, misinterpreted, or considered fakes. Future research and a continued excavation of new material will eventually prove, pro or con, the case for casting. It was not many years ago that annealing of copper was considered beyond the capabilities of prehistoric natives. This is no longer the prevailing view in the light of numerous new artifacts and the results of their metallurgical testing. I believe the Midwest prehistoric Indians did cast. Hard evidence centers on Hopewellian and Mississippian sites. This conclusion is based on the following. 1. Other prehistoric people using similar natural resources casted in Asia, Europe, Middle East, Africa, South and Central America, and the Southwest United States over long periods of time. Many of these cultures were inferior, if not equal, in social and technological development when compared to the Hopewell or Mississippian Midwest. 2. Copper, sand, wood, clay, and stone were plentiful and used by the population through local gathering and extended trade. 3. Supporting technology was in common use for long periods of time. This included metalworking, forced air furnaces 900 plus degrees Celsius, and high heat pottery technology. 4. There is evidence that furnaces at the Turner Mounds and crucibles at Cahokia were used in copper working areas, and experiments show that casting tools and sand molds could have been used but would rarely survive high heat natural weathering processes. 5. A documented artifact, the Turner Mounds, that reached casting temperature, and hundreds of semi-documented artifacts showing evidence of casting, bubbles, flow lines, etc. A substantial number of undocumented surface fine castings similar in shape and size, though derived from variable size flow copper nuggets. This is indicative of the process of casting blanks, which are later wrought worked rather than wrought work multi-size lumps, and laboriously trimming them to size. 7. Numerous but poorly documented copper specimens which give the appearance of being manufactured by hammering only, but show casting bubbles radiographically. 8. Relative lack of copper scrap at some of the metalworking sites, Cahokia, Turner, implying reconstitution by melting. There are other sites at which high heat furnaces were not evident, and these exhibit large accumulations of scrap. 9. Documented sites where furnaces capable of high heat were built, and the existence of vitrified crucibles at a copper workshop, Cahokia. Identification of copper shot, and a melted, quote-unquote, copper artifact at Turner. At the Turner site, Turner Mounds site. I hope we can finish this for you guys. Hold on. Ten, historical accounts of pre-contact natives casting and abandoned prehistoric sites with melted copper waste, referring to Champlain, referring to them melting and casting. Documented casting concurrently done by native groups with 1,200 miles of the Midwest. These occurrences are individually unique and subject to question, but collectively they give support to the theory that casting was a technological reality in the prehistoric Midwest. The evidence mentioned supports the 5 criteria mentioned at the beginning of this paper for establishing a casting technology. The copper metal was 1, available, 2, collected, 3, high heat was used, 4, furnaces and other casting tools were in use, 5, castings were found. Okay, so I'm not going to go into the criticisms because they're fair, whatever those criticisms are, but their research on the other side of it is just theoretical as well. So it's whoever's theory you like better. This seems to show evidence of casting by these ancient peoples who seem to be these large hominids. So I wanted you guys to see this because we're often talking about these copper artifacts, and I had begged the question in my last video, has any sort of comprehensive study done of these things? And here's one of them that refers to casting. And I've seen a lot of these cast arrowheads, knives, and other things that seem to be cast, and similar